to our fifth and final lunch and learn around our new vision, CTE Without Limits, or Without Limits, a shared vision for the future of CTE. We're really excited to have you here. I cannot believe we've already gone through all 5 of the lunch and learns and all the principles. Feels like just yesterday we started this series, and I'm excited to see many of you who've been to some or all of those, as well as some of you who might be new and joining us for the first time. So accomplishing this new vision is going to take a shared commitment and shared ownership among leaders and practitioners at all levels in our system, which is why we've invited 2 of our partners in the development of this vision who have signed on to speak about kind of their perceptions on it, the work they're doing, how this impacts their membership, and opportunities to make some connections. So I'm going to just kick us off, and then we'll turn to our speakers. But we have Christina Sedney from the Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education, Dale Winkler from the Southern Regional Education Board, and Stephen Pruitt from SREB as well. So before we jump in, we'd love to know who's in the room, virtual room. So we're going to launch a quick poll just to get a sense of who is in attendance and how much you know about this principle as you kind of come into it. All right. Slowly coming through. I like that I can see the data. You guys can't see it yet, but it's great. All right, give it just another few seconds. We got a couple more responses. All right. Well, it seems like we got wow, that is like a perfect distribution for those that are statisticians in the group in terms of how much we know, at like a perfect little bell shape. In terms of how prepared you all feel, seems like we've got some work to do, which makes sense given this is in some ways kind of not necessarily our most ambitious, but some of our most forward-looking principle. And then looks like we've got about half of you from secondary, about a quarter from post-secondary, and then kind of distribution among some of our other stakeholder groups. So great, thank you all for sharing. So let's get started. So how we're going to do is I'm going to spend just a few minutes just reacclimating everyone about the vision, about Principle 5, given we've got those that know a lot about it, so those of you who know very little about it. And then we'll hear from our speakers. We'll have some kind of moderated discussion, again, kind of having their interpretations, their impressions, and what really is working and where do we need to lean in a little bit further as a field to accomplish Principle 5. We'll then have some small group discussions so you can all process, reflect, share with each other what you're all doing, and then we'll come back and spend our last few minutes just doing a report out on some major takeaways. So some of these slides will look familiar, but back in September 2020, Advanced CTE was joined by 9 national partner organizations to host CTE Forward, a summit on CTE's impact and promise, which we virtually brought together nearly 200 national, state, and local leaders representing the full continuum of CTE, K-12, post-secondary workforce development, business industry, philanthropy, researchers, practitioners, policymakers, students, you name it, they were in the virtual room to really give some input. And the goal was to design, kind of have the participants co-create a shared vision, which would serve as a true north for the CTE community and our key partners. Over the course of several months, we worked with partner organizations, our members, our board, to synthesize and prioritize the ideas, strategies, and goals that were generated during the summit. I don't have this slide, but kind of the output was about 4,500 sticky notes that then were synthesized into this document, Without Limits, which was released in March 2021. This vision is anchored in the belief, the simple belief, that each learner must have access to and the means to be successful in the career of their choice. So I think everyone can agree that this is what we need to be pointing to, but obviously this is easier said than done. This is not an easy thing to accomplish. And so to accomplish this, to achieve this, requires that all systems are working in concert to advance this vision. And that is, again, the K-12 post-secondary workforce, but also credit, non-credit, kind of academic, core academics and technical. Really, we think about systems across the board really coming together to say, this is what we believe in, we're willing to collaborate to do so. It also requires a commitment to tearing down the barriers that limit opportunities. And we're going to talk about one of those barriers today, which is a geographic barrier that often can be a limitation kind of within a state, within communities, as well as across states. And that we believe that CT can be positioned as a catalyst to make this vision a reality. We often talk about how CT lives at the nexus between all these systems. We're part of K-12, we're part of post-secondary, we work with post-secondary, we work directly with the private sector to make sure our programs are responsive. So given that position that we kind of sit within and across all these systems, we really believe that we could be a catalyst to drive this type of collaborative, collective, and critical change. So this is truly a shared vision. To date, we have over 40 national organizations have joined with us to sign on to support this vision. And these organizations represent, again, state and local leaders across all of those different sectors I've mentioned a few times. And these organizations have all signaled their commitment to using this vision to advance their own work and the goals that we have set collectively. And that plays out in many ways. And this is just so important because, as I'll go through the principles in a moment, no one organization or sector can fully realize the aspiration of this vision alone. Only by working together with a full tent of all those core partners can this vision of CT That Limits, which is supported by a cohesive, flexible, and responsive ecosystem, truly become a reality within and across states. So again, this should be hopefully familiar to some, if not all of you, the 5 principles within the vision. And these are really interconnected and equally critical. There's kind of no order of operations. We think they're all really important to drive us forward. So I'm not going to read through them, but really it's about building this cohesive, flexible, and responsive career prep ecosystem, which attends to the fact that all learners can be welcome, supported by, and successful in that system, anchored in providing those opportunities for career navigation, so that individuals, wherever they are in their career journey, have the information, tools, and supports they need to be successful. And we really ensure we've got portability and value of skills, so putting skills first above degrees, above kind of traditional systems. And then finally, as we'll talk about today, that each learner can access CT without borders, and I'll come back to that in one moment. Also important are there are 5 foundational commitments, which we really think of are the non-negotiable. These are kind of the cross-cutting commitments that have to be in place to accomplish this vision. And really briefly, those commitments are a commitment to equity, and this is all dimensions of equity, and we'll be talking about some of those today: educational, racial, socioeconomic, gender, and geographic. Commitment to quality programs, instructors, instruction, work-based learning, and credentials of value. Commitment to meaningful partnerships where industry are deeply invested and involved in the design, delivery, and success of our system, not just a transactional, but really a true two-way partnership. A commitment to actionable, transparent, and trustworthy data. And finally, to continuous improvement and leadership at all levels within our system. As I've mentioned before, this can't happen just by top down. This can't happen just bottom up. This really requires that commitment at all levels in our system. So today we're here to talk about principle 5, which is that each learner can access CT without borders. And this principle calls on states to collaborate even more than they have in the past to expand access and remove those geographic barriers. And this requires states come together to develop and expand new models of collaboration, invest in cross-state and in-state open access systems, as well as create some common frameworks for defining and delivering CTE. And this principle is probably the one more so than any other that really emerged because of COVID. If we had gone through this summit and convened individuals to talk about where CT was and needs to go, and COVID had not occurred, I don't know that this notion, this discussion would have evolved, and we would have a principle level about removing borders. And I think that is one of, we often talk about what are the opportunities, how does this disruption changing the way that we engage in education and see the system and want to remove barriers. And so that is, I think, one exciting aspect is this conversation that has really evolved that, again, a year and a half ago, we might not have had, or we're not having in the same way of intentionality. So what does this look like to accomplish this? I've mentioned, but one is work is going on right now, led by Advanced CTE, a really collaborative effort to modernize the National Peer Clusters framework to really better connect education and the workforce. And so as this work evolves, we hope that it will provide that common language and some structural alignment to bridge education and work and really create more opportunities to empower learners. to be able to explore, decide on, and prepare for the dynamic and evolving careers. So just as the past 20 years, this framework has really been kind of a shared vision, a shared framework, and kind of a way of talking about and organizing CTE across the states, we really hope the modernized version can usher new ways of collaboration. The second, and we're going to spend most of our time on bullet 2 and 3 today, is developing and expanding interstate compacts that support collaboration and the flow of data, credits, credentials, and learners to remove those barriers. And so we're going to talk about this both in terms of interstate compacts, but also talking about what it looks like to really remove those barriers within states to create more access to programs, to work-based learning, to credentials that may be limited options you have in your own community. And then finally, states really need to invest. We need to be investing, not just states, but at the national level, the federal level, in research and development to ensure that the virtual opportunities, which are continuing, and obviously we all hoped that those would be kind of fading out and created as an option. Now it's obviously still needs to be the only option in some states and some communities. But as we continue to invest in these and create these new ways of learners to be able to access instruction, access instructors, access work-based learning, that they're quality, that they're equitable, and that they're meaningful. We've all been doing a lot of innovation, all been doing a lot of testing things out, and now's the time to make sure that what we're putting our capacity behind is really having those outcomes we want to see. So with that, I am going to pretty much stop sharing my screen, and reintroduce our panelists, Christina, Dale, and Stephen, who are going to be talking about kind of how work they have underway, what this principle means to them, and some of their reflections going forward. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over. Let me just pull up my discussion question. So kind of first question for all three of you is, what does this principle mean to your work and to your membership? Just kind of how would you interpret this, and why is it important to you and your members? So why don't we start with Dale and Stephen? I'll start with our SREB partners.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you. For SREB, this principle means working collaboratively. As you already said, it's a great opportunity for states to come together to ensure all students in their region have access to high quality programs of study that align with the students' career aptitudes and interests. SREB was created by Southern governors and legislators who recognized the link between education and economic vitality, but more importantly, they recognized that they could accomplish more by working together. Originally focused on higher education alone, SREB developed a way to enable member states to share specialized graduate level and professional education programs to combat shortages of trained professionals in those areas in the region. And now the Interstate Compact is well positioned to help each learner in the region gain access to high quality CTE programs. The Interstate Compact can serve as the information source that collects and disseminates data on such items as finance, participation in CTE programs, student progress and completion on shared programs, looking at affordability, faculty credentials, and quality standards. There's already a framework in place for helping more students have access to programs of study that are not available in their state through the academic common market that you might have heard of. And so this framework, we feel, is a great way to expand CTE opportunities. And it also is the interstate compacts can facilitate reciprocity agreements and micro-credentials that may help address teacher shortages. Stephen, is there something you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just add quickly that, the other aspect with how we do our work, because we work, especially through Dale's office, all the way to the classroom level, we also are working on the other end, which, there are actual statutes, regulations that sometimes inhibit and maybe even prohibit the ability of states to work together. So that, I think, is a prime place where we can really add some value and help cultivate those conversations. I mean, look, the issue that's facing us is, and this is why this work and our partnership with Advanced CTE is so important. We know that over the next decade, I know in SREB world anyway, we've been predicting the effect that automation and artificial intelligence is going to have on our workforce. In the South, should there not be any change, we are predicting there may be as many as 18 million unemployable adults by 2030. When we followed that up, we saw that the 8 weeks that we were shut down for COVID accelerated dependence on automation by 5 years. So now we may not have to 2030 anymore. We may actually only have to 2025. So the work that Dale's laid out, along with the sense of urgency that we have, means that we've got to really put our foot on the pedal here to make sure that our students across the country have access to quality career and tech options.
Thanks. I'm going to turn to Christina and we'll circle back on some of the things you guys have shared.
Great, thanks, Kate. And I will say our answer is actually very similar to SREB's. So we're an interstate compact of the Western states. We're created for a lot of the same reasons. And really, the heart of what we do, why we were created, was to expand access across state lines to post-secondary opportunities. And so we really see Principle 5 and the CTE work as an extension of that, and really just sort of a 21st century version of expanding those high quality opportunities across state lines, but with a CTE focus. And just as Dale and Stephen have shared, at WICHE we really serve as a convener, sharing ideas across state lines, and then also bringing together lots of different groups. I think one of our unique strengths as compacts is, we work with legislators, we work with post-secondary folks, we work with state agencies. So having, lots of different relationships with workforce boards, with workforce agencies. And, as Kate mentioned at the beginning, CTE, there are so many players, and that's an opportunity, but also a challenge. And so, helping to centralize all those groups together. And so that's why, I think Principle 5 resonates so deeply with us as an organization. And I guess maybe the last thing I would just add is, again, echoing a point Kate made at the beginning, but I think CTE really has the opportunity and the potential to be a catalyst for collaboration, because it's really popular. I think CTE is in this very lucky position, and particularly you see this in our region where we have very different states. You have Idaho, you have South Dakota, we have California, we have Hawaii. But CTE is something that has great support in all of those different states. And so I think there's a real opportunity here to bring states that wouldn't necessarily work together in some instances to work together here.
That's great. And something that you guys each kind of share, that I'm just making that connection. I think what's so important is to accomplish this vision, right? Or this principle in particular, is there's a lot of barriers. There's a lot of regulatory, legislative barriers, just political barriers. And so being able to pull in across state those policymakers, decision makers, about, are we willing to come together and tear down those barriers in order to create access, is, I think, a place where both your organizations can really play a key role in identifying what those barriers are, and then brokering some of those conversations across states to say, yes, we're willing to remove these restrictions on data sharing, or remove these restrictions on, or create reciprocity. So just putting that charge out there. Christina, I want to come back to you a little bit, because this, as you mentioned, you have a lot of compacts focused particularly in the post-secondary space, and a core element is building more of these, right? Leveraging existing ones, expanding them, and then identifying where there are new opportunities for new interstate compacts between states to be able to kind of, again, expand access. So you have a number of efforts: your interstate passport, your multi-state data exchange project, and others. So love to hear. I mean, this is hard work. I know we've talked about this a number of times. This is complex and political and a lot of moving pieces. So love to hear, what have you learned? What are the lessons learned? If you go back and could do it again, you'd be addressing, and that could particularly be applied for expanding CT across state lines.
Yeah, absolutely, Kate, thank you. And I think where I'd start is actually that there are a number of different ways that you can achieve interstate collaboration. So, we've talked about compacts, and so a compact itself is a formal legislatively enacted agreement between two or more states. And so that requires, the legislatures of two or more states to come together. For certain types of compacts, it actually requires federal approval as well, congressional, but only certain types. So that's what WICHE itself is, that's what SREB is, and that's kind of the highest, most formal. I guess I shouldn't put it in a hierarchy. It is the most formal, but there's really a continuum. There are also interstate agreements. You heard Stephen reference reciprocity agreements, and those can function in all different types of ways. They're typically, I would say, a little easier to get off the ground than a formal compact. So you might have a memorandum of understanding between a set of state agencies So for example, in data sharing projects that WICHE has worked on, that's how they were achieved. And then finally, at kind of the most informal level, you can just have a network or agreements between institutions or school districts or things like that across state lines that don't necessarily need either a legislative or a state agency angle. So there are these kind of different ways that interstate collaboration can be achieved. And I think an important question is really thinking about, what do you need for the goals that you have in mind? And then in reflecting back, on the different projects which he has done, and we've done some in each of these types of agreements, some common elements of success. And I think this is not going to surprise anybody, but at the heart of all of it is shared goals. So, really having a shared common goal is that North Star of your project that you're working on. And I think within that also really articulating the value proposition for each party. So, do you maybe not have enough students in your state, but then right across the border, there's a program that is oversubscribed, and could there be gains from trade there? So, really thinking about what are those shared values that you have that are going to drive you to create this agreement and agreeing on those. I think also identifying the right stakeholders is really, really critical and often more complicated than people realize. We say state as if it's a monolith, and we all know that it's not. You have your governor's office, your K-12 department, your Department of Higher Education, districts, and they're not necessarily all rowing in the same direction. They don't necessarily, all have the same goals. And so really identifying who the players you need for your collaboration are, and then also recognizing that might be different across state lines. Your state might have one department that oversees K-12 and higher ed, and your neighboring state might not, so really understanding the differences there. And then finally, also thinking about those non-state actors too. So accreditors in the higher ed sector, professional licensure boards, if you're, using a program that requires their approval. So really just kind of thinking through all the players at the beginning, I think is really critical for success. I'd also say building and maintaining relationships, just, trying to build a community of practice with shared interactions over time is really critical. And then finally, I'm sorry, I have a lot to say about this one, but I'll wrap it up here, is really thinking about shared governance models. It's not necessarily the most, a sexy topic, but I think it's really, really critical to success. So, thinking about who are the parties, how will they be represented in the decision making, and then having an agreed upon process for the decision making in whatever interstate agreement that you end up executing, or within state too. Having something that all the parties agree on is really, really critical for success. And I will leave it there.
Great. I know there's a lot more to unpack, but I think some really important kind of what you set up at the beginning that is critical to actually have that sustained, right? And not just have it kind of turned over when there's changes in leadership or commitment. I want to pivot a little bit. So Dale and Stephen, I'm going to turn back to you. As I mentioned, right, this is the principle in many ways is most relevant in kind of the era of COVID. And the third action really digs into the opportunities afforded by virtual instruction while cautioning that more research, right, is absolutely critical to make sure we're doing it right. So what have you seen, observed, heard about as some of the kind of greatest innovations in virtual or remote instruction in the CT space over the past 18 months?
Well, we've seen our CTE instructors be introduced to a variety of virtual technology and ways of delivering instruction. But virtual reality makes it possible for health science students to not just read about the respiratory system, but to go inside the virtual body and investigate. Virtual reality makes it possible for students to take apart an engine, put together a wind turbine, to explore components of machinery. The possibilities are limitless. And virtual reality expands the learning options for students. And so what we've seen in the pandemic and through the related recovery funding, it's really accelerated many school districts' plans to implement one-to-one devices. So today, more students than before the pandemic have tools needed to participate in virtual or blended instruction. And we have instructors who are becoming better equipped to deliver quality instruction in a virtual format. However, there's still a lot of professional learning needed on this topic. SREB in the end of March last year had to shift all of its coaching and professional learning to a virtual format like so many other organizations had to do. But what we ended up spending the majority of our time doing is really helping teachers and instructors learn about quality virtual instruction. Virtual CTE instruction, though, also allows teachers and professors to take advantage of the kinds of open educational resources that have become a mainstay for online post-secondary programs. OERs offer freely available materials for teachers and students to use, to adapt and share, including lab simulations and recorded lectures and presentation. And SREB maintains a list of online teaching and learning resources that lab-based science and CTE teachers. However, more research is needed on OER. And we also need to think about some quality standards that need to be put in place there for these resources.
And a plug, I know you guys have been doing a ton in the OER space around dual enrollment, which I think is also another, when you think about access and creating opportunities, I think is a really exciting space, right, to really create more opportunities there. So I guess I just want to follow up on that a little bit of, we think about the data that needs to be collected, the research questions that, because we've talked to many states, and I think there's a lot of interest in continuing virtual as an option, right, for students who want it, for schools that want it, maybe not as a forced option, but kind of another option to create more access. So, what would you recommend in terms of the data that should be collected, the research questions that should be asked kind of as states or communities are building out their virtual learning?
There are a couple of things regarding research. There's a need to study what are the gaps in readiness development. One student does everything face-to-face and another virtual. What are the gaps on either side? And use that information to figure out how a blended approach can best close some of these gaps. Another item to study is the balance of how instructional time is used when teachers and students are working remotely. One of our senior instructional coaches brought this one to my attention. For example, if teachers increase the amount of independent time for students to be responsible for their theory or classwork, and that work was not immediately completed with lab or practice or application due to lack of access, and was then provided in a more intense, shorter time frame, are the learning outcomes different? And if there's a shift in the balance of how teachers use their instructional time, such as when and how, definitely one we'd like to look at. Definitely you want to look at, though, I think some way to measure participation and engagement in the virtual format, and then compare completion and then also credential attainment for those who do a virtual versus maybe a traditional face-to-face.
Thanks. I think those are really, really useful. And then, of course, having kind of that disaggregation, that through line of, is it equitable? Who has access? What are those outcomes? And how does that, differ based on race, gender, community, geography, and kind of all those different dimensions. So I'm going to ask one more question, which is, to all three of you, or both organizations, I should say. So this principle has really resonated, I think, with many of our rural states. As no surprise, given I think geography has often been a barrier, right, in highly rural frontier states. So your organizations represent many states that have large rural populations. And so when you think about what are some of the opportunities, I'll just stick with that. There's barriers, we all know the barriers. What are some of the opportunities to expanding access to CTE and work-based learning for rural learners at both the secondary and post-secondary levels? And why don't we start with Christina this time?
Sure. And this is, I guess, maybe the obvious answer, but I think it's so critical, is broadband access. And that's something, those are conversations that are happening in all of our states. And I think we're at a real moment of opportunity here. There's a lot of federal funding flowing to support this, and both for broadband and also, as Dale mentioned, in terms of just technology access, devices for students, hotspots for students. There's money flowing to colleges from the CARES Act, from the American Rescue Plan, where they can invest in those types of things. So I think we're at a real tipping point, and also just a recognition that internet access is really critical for our learners. So accessing these virtual opportunities that Dale talked about, I think we're at a real moment of opportunity, and I hope we really are able to capitalize on that.
I would add also, as we look at expanding the borders and the boundaries, that this would also be an opportunity for students to accomplish two things: moving away from the place where the training is it has to be in a certain place in the building and so forth. How we can partner with business and industry to provide opportunities for students to gain the skills needed for those in-demand jobs and grant credit for that, but also a closer collaboration between our secondary and our post-secondary institutions to provide more opportunities for students to earn those early post-secondary opportunities that they can benefit from. And so I think now with the technology, as we start doing more research,
While he's becoming unfrozen.
Any other irony that he froze on the word technology? Just want to put that.
Yeah, that's kind of funny. That's kind of funny. Yeah, I would also just add that, you know, I do think this is a fundamental shift in thinking. You know, it's one thing to say, let's look for the barriers and remove them. It's another to say, we want to get to this place. Now let's find the barriers that prohibit us getting there. You know, I think that nobody well, at least I'd like to think most people don't intentionally put up barriers, but it's also very easy to be, you know, stuck in the status quo. It's easy for us to get very comfortable. And so, you know, there are opportunities out there. You know, an example is when Dale and I were in Kentucky, there was a school that 5 districts came together to create that was focused on careers. And they wanted to do this so that those students in those rural areas would have access to various career pathways. And so that was a goal to do that. Well, then working with the department and others, they found the barriers that needed to be removed and move forward. You know, we hear all the time, you know, advanced manufacturing in particular, oh, we can't have 16-year-olds or even 17, 18-year-olds on the floor because of, you know, the liability insurance. Well, you know, Mary Taylor in Kentucky figured out that if you have a statewide contract with ADECO, there's a way to get around that. But I think that it's one, because anything can be a barrier. So if you look for the barriers, you're going to find them. But are they the right barriers, and can you really move forward? An accountability system is another great example of that. Have you cultivated an accountability system that is not just simply punitive, but is also incentivizes people to make good decisions and to seek unusual or atypical solutions to their common challenges?
I love that drawback. And it reminds me, you know, much like Christina's response about how do you create this collaboration? I think same thing as what are those goals? And if the goal is about expanding access, then, and you keep that as your North Star, then the barrier shouldn't be insurmountable because you know you have a common vision you're trying to work towards. I hope this changes the conversation in rural. I mean, I think there has been some innovation in many of these states around technology, around, you know, creating satellite campuses, around remote instruction that has been around for decades. But hopefully that's something that can really take hold, not just in rural communities, right, but also in urban communities and suburban communities where you just don't have that sector, you don't have the capacity within your system to provide those opportunities. We can ensure every learner has the social capital, has their opportunities to explore and to build those skills. So that's the dream, that's the vision, I should say, and hopefully we can all work those. So I am seeing that we need to move. I am sorry there wasn't a lot of time for Q&A. If there's 1 or 2 questions people want to share, please to do so. We'll have some time during the breakouts. Our speakers will be kind of in the true room. So we're gonna spend about 15 or so minutes, or about 20 minutes, I guess, in small group discussions. We'll have some prompts. Myself and some of my colleagues from Advanced CTE will help facilitate those, and then we'll come back together just to close out. So thank you so much, Christina, Stephen, and Dale.